What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Latin American Politics. I hope that you're having a fantastic day. I'm doing pretty well. Had a nice weekend, although I know that many of you are probably disappointed about Thanksgiving plans. Um, Mine were cut short. I had planned on returning home to visit my family after about a year away. And because the CDC recommendation decided I couldn't go, and I know that many of you are in a similar situation, maybe kept in place because of the circumstances. Obviously, it's really bad out there. So, don't do anything brash, be safe, be responsible, but try to enjoy yourself. Before we begin the Thanksgiving break, we do have a couple days of classes. And of course, we're meeting today, and you're here now. And I'm so glad that you're here now. We're going to talk about a really interesting and really important topic, and that is organized crime in Latin America. This is a topic that we don't know much about, but one thing we do know is that organized crime has a disastrous impact in countries throughout the region, politically, economically, and socially. So we'll talk about that. Before we get started today, I want to talk briefly about some current events, and especially in Peru. Now, Peru's political parties are at it again. As we know, the party system in Peru is highly fragmented. It means that in Congress there are more than a dozen parties, and most of the parties have only a sliver of the overall vote share. Moreover, most of those parties are new parties that are dominated by individual personalities who have often peeled away from larger parties as a result of elite struggles. In Peru, that fragmented party system has meant that over the years, the Congress has come into contact with the executive and collided many times. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the last 5 presidents have been impeached by the Peruvian Congress. So although the Peruvian Congress is filled with parties who can't agree on much, they seem to agree on the need to impeach presidents. And this is sort of the defining feature of Peruvian politics today, just kind of perpetual crises, institutional crises between the executive and the legislature. And the most recent crisis came about 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, when Martin Vizcarra, the former president of Peru, democratically elected, was impeached by the Congress. And the backstory is that Vizcarra had actually dissolved the Congress legally about a year ago. Now, we won't go into the specifics, but there is a mechanism that allows the Peruvian president to dissolve the Congress. This, in some ways, was payback for Vizcarra dissolving the Congress. But since Vizcarra was impeached, there have been massive protests against the Congress and against the parties. And people are outraged by the impeachment and the continual crises in Peruvian politics. And what really illustrated the height of the crisis was when Manuel Moreno took power as the interim president, but stepped down within about 2 days because of the continuation of the protests. Now, at present, Peru has a new interim president, and I'm forgetting his name, but the new interim president is well known as sort of a moderating force who traditionally has defended democratic institutions in Peru and has been an advocate. The situation in Peru is obviously very problematic, but the situation in Peru really reflects the situation on the ground in a lot of Latin American countries. We know that Peru is not the only country with a fragmented party system. We know that many countries throughout the region have party systems where parties are relatively weak, poorly institutionalized, disorderly, They have a limited ideological basis. They don't cling to the same ideology. They change from election to election. And in general, this weakness is destabilizing democracy. And so the big picture is that the weakness of political parties in Peru and elsewhere in Latin America is really weakening democracy. And it's making it more difficult to consolidate democratic institutions. And it's making it easier for authoritarian um, presidents and would-be rulers to consolidate power. And that's been happening throughout the region increasingly in the last 10 years as well. And so Peru then is sort of like a microcosm of Latin America, although it does exhibit the extreme in terms of the fragmentation and the level of crisis. You know, before we continue, as always, I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on this. Does anyone have a comment or an idea about this? Has anyone been following this? Do you have any thoughts? What do you think?
I feel this is very devastating for the people of Peru. All these things happening with their president being impeached and not having like a solid governed state. It's kind of tragic to see that, especially in a place like Peru where like they're very diverse. So I don't know. It's just I feel it's very tragic to see all these things happening.
Yeah, Bell, it's definitely not good for democracy, right? Like, you
Yeah,
know,
definitely.
yeah, and Quinn makes a comment in the chat. Well, what about Vizcarra? You know, why was he impeached? Why was he impeached, and why did he dissolve the Congress? So, if I'm remembering correctly, he dissolved the Congress because of some sort of deadlock within the Congress. Like, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't reach some sort of a resolution that was necessary to govern, and this was sort of like a reflection of some of the weaknesses of the parties in the disorder and the fragmentation. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the dissolution of the Congress initiated new elections. And the new elections basically resulted in a similar outcome in terms of who made up the Congress. And so Vizcarra was sort of a popular figure. And, you know, he did win the election in Peru. And to Abel's comment, this kind of undermines democracy in Peru because the voters did directly elect Vizcarra. And while impeachment is a constitutional process, everyone, and really most of the people commenting on this development in Peru, see it as a political coup, a sort of impeachment gone awry because it doesn't have a real firm foundation. It doesn't seem very legitimate. It seems like kind of a rogue Congress impeaching a president. And they've done this so many times before that there are questions about how valid the process is anymore when it's been seemingly abused. But the general point is that democracy is really at stake here because people are losing faith in democratic institutions. They've long since lost that faith in Peru. And so when these kinds of things happen, people become more willing to support an alternative, like an authoritarian regime, or maybe some kind of an illiberal alternative that would be somewhere in between authoritarian rule and democracy. Yeah, Quinn, it's still complicated though, right? Like, you know, it's difficult to always know, well, who's really who's really at fault here, or how can we understand this? And I think that there's always two sides to the story. So before we continue, the last thing I want to say is that this is really sort of a critical test, I think, for Latin America, because what happens here in Peru will indicate the sort of resolve and the capacity of these institutions to manage and to fix some of the problems and some of the internal contradictions. We know that Latin American societies are highly diverse, and we've often talked about how that means there are many, many political parties. Whether these Latin American democracies can consolidate themselves and kind of sort out some of those those divisions that sometimes undermine the system. Whether they can do that will sort of shape the survival of these regimes. And so keep an eye on Peru going forward, but also pay attention to countries like Brazil, Ecuador, and to some degree even Chile, because fragmentation is more and more of an issue there, as we go forward and as people increasingly lose faith in democratic institutions there because of similar problems. So we're dealing then with a new topic today, and this topic is the politics of organized crime. When you think about Latin America and organized crime, you think about images like this, where you see these sort of alleged, um, criminals or gang members being rounded up by the state or by the sort of security forces who are maybe masked to conceal their identity for fear of reprisal by the criminal gang targeted here. You see, of course, the children in the community being affected by the conflict between the gangs, and then, of course, the relationship between the state and the criminal gangs. And you see the cities where these scenes take place and unfold. This is a very common sight. This happens to be an image from El Salvador from the last year or so. And this highlights part of what we'll discuss today, which is El Salvador's war on gangs. And the situation in El Salvador is very much like the situation in many Latin American countries, in that criminal violence is a serious problem. And it's mainly perpetrated by criminal gangs who may or may not be involved in drug trafficking, but always seem to proliferate in cities and in metropolitan centers in Brazil and Argentina. Every country in the region seems to have some issue with criminal violence. Even Uruguay, Montevideo, although Uruguay is a smaller country that's more exceptional. These scenes are what we'll be contextualizing and discussing today. This focus on organized crime, the various players involved, the nature of the state's response to criminal gangs. And we'll talk about the stakes and the impact of all of the above. And so before we continue, let me check on the chat here and see who is commenting. Jose, I'm not sure. I think that it was a battle between the two institutions, and it often is in Peru. But who was more corrupt is sort of a separate question, I think. Everyone knows that legislators in Peru and elsewhere are often corrupt. How corrupt and who was more corrupt is a separate question. 80 in Peru and cities like Lima, the crime rates are higher than elsewhere in the world. So we're going to begin this lecture / discussion with a poll, as we often do. And before I set up this poll, I just want to read to you a series of statements. And as always, the objective here is to sort of figure out whether these statements or what they have in common. And I'll give you two choices here in a moment. The choices are all of them are true or all of them are false. And the statements are as follows. First, Latin America is the second most violent region in the world. Second, crime in the region fell between 2000 and 2020. And three, the homicide rate in the region is twice the global average. So I want you to stop and think about these statements. And I want you to think about them in relation to each other while I go ahead and set up a poll that we can work with.
Did you already administer the poll?
I'm gonna do that right now. I was setting that up.
Okay.
Yeah.
My bad.
No worries. Okay, everybody, I've launched the poll, and just respond at your pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Got it. Thank you.
We're just about done. It looks like there are a few people who maybe haven't responded yet. Getting closer. Okay. Take about another 20 seconds or so. Try to get these last couple votes. Okay, with 96% reporting, or 96% having voted, 17 of you, or 71%, said that all of these statements are true. 7 of you, or 29% of you, said that all of them are false. And I want you to know, before I show you the results, I'll share the results. You can take a look if you want. But before I show you the results, I want you to know that I made these questions a little bit more difficult. You might be surprised at the result, but these statements are all false. And before we continue, does anyone want to comment on why these statements might all be false, or what they sort of miss or they understate? What else is there to the story that these statements are missing?
I was surprised by the second one because I honestly thought that crime in general was falling, but not by much.
Yeah. So the second one is interesting because you might assume, for example, that a transition from authoritarian rule to democracy should coincide with a reduction in crime, right? This is the expectation that, a lot of people had. But in reality, in Latin America, the reverse turned out to be true. That period between 2000 and 2020 that coincided with sort of the consolidation of democracy in a lot of countries in the region also coincided with increases in crime, and pretty substantial increases in some cases. Very interesting, surprising. As Quinn points out, not really maybe what we expect. Does anyone else want? Oh, please
sorry.
go ahead, Abel. Sorry.
So I chose false because I was born in Mexico, and I was born in 2001, and I lived all the way to 2010, where I was still living in Mexico, and I was uh, I was there when Calderon was still president of Mexico, and I remember being a lot of crime during that period of time, and that's kind of the reasons I decided not the crime didn't lower, in fact, increase. And I also decided this factor because when you look at immigration from Central America and Latin America overall to the U.S., you'll find that major reasons that people leave Latin America is because of crime,
Absolutely. And that,
especially during that time. Sorry.
right. No, no, no. So Abel, when did you come to the United States? When did you leave Mexico?
I lived in Mexico when I was 2010. Yeah, I believe it was by the end of 2010 and
Yeah.
entering 2011.
So your
Around that
impression
time.
was that that crime was on the increase.
Yeah, that's kind of the major reason I even left Mexico because of crime rate, and I had to leave because my family was in danger of being harmed by this crime and all this other aspects.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Abel. These are the kinds of experiences that we'll talk more about in the class today as we unravel these facts in this context. So Eddie says, I changed my opinion after voting because the second one kind of contradicts the other two. Maricela says, the first one I thought it was true because I think that the Middle East has higher than Latin America. I was unsure with number two. Be it during this time there was a lot of migration causing it to fall. So Latin America is the most violent region in the world. Its homicide rates and its violent crime rates for the region as a whole are substantially higher than other regions. In fact, as number three points out, the homicide rate in the region is actually 4 times the global average. 4 times, not 2 times, not 3 times, 4 times. And crime in the region actually increased between 2000 and 2020. It increased pretty substantially in some places. In a country like Mexico, for example, narco violence actually increased during the first 15 years after the transition to democracy. Abel said that he came to the US from Mexico in 2010. Mexico transitioned to democracy more or less in the late 1990s. And so that first 10 years after the transition was a period of a lot of change in Mexico. And one of the changes that took place was the collapse of what was called the plaza system. And the plaza system was basically this agreement between the government, the central government in Mexico, and the major drug gangs. And for many decades during the end of the 20th century, leading up to the transition to democracy eventually, that agreement contributed to a lot of peace because the agreement was if the gangs didn't fight each other, they could be allowed to operate if they provided the state a cut of the revenue. Now, the collapse of the authoritarian regime also meant the collapse of the plaza system. And so new democratic governments in Mexico didn't have the advantage of that agreement, and narco violence increased dramatically in the country. And so by 2010, the country was in the grip of intense gang violence. And it remains a challenge in Mexico. It remains a challenge in Central America in general, as well as Mexico, distinguishing between the Northern Triangle and Mexico as parts of Latin America. But this is the situation in Latin America. Organized crime, especially related to criminal gangs and often drug gangs, is a serious enterprise, and it reaches and influences the very apex of government, and it compromises communities and security forces, and it makes people change their behavior. It contributes to all sorts of social problems, And it's one of the biggest challenges in Latin America, along with inequality and some other issues. So we're going to be talking about this today, and we'll address this as thoroughly as we can. But what I'll tell you right off the bat is that we don't know a lot about this. This is a topic that is increasingly important, but one that's very difficult to study for obvious reasons. And so we'll focus on a few questions that help us to zero in on the key issues involved. And those questions are as follows. First, why has organized crime become so significant in the region? What explains this rise that Abel himself noticed in Mexico and that is observable throughout the region in the last 20 years? Number two, who are the major players? Who's really involved here? Number three, what is the impact? What are the most important implications? And then number four, how has the US responded, or what has the US response been? So we'll distinguish this discussion from our discussion on narco trafficking and narco politics, which will take place after we return from Thanksgiving break. Today, we'll talk about the activities of criminal gangs, which might include drug gangs, but not necessarily or not exclusively. As you'll see in El Salvador, some gangs aren't that involved in drug trafficking, although all gangs are involved in organized crime and other sorts of illegal activities. So before I continue, let me comment and read Jose's chat, who says, also the infusion of American weapons has increased the violence rate of Mexico. Most of the weapons the cartels use nowadays were rampantly provided in the 2000s. Exactly, Jose, and this is actually one cause that we'll discuss here in a moment when we discuss the reasons why violent crime has increased. The availability and access to violent military grade weapons have increased substantially. So that's one of the reasons that the situation in Mexico got as bad as it did, and why countries like El Salvador have a serious challenge as well. So we're going to focus on the case of El Salvador today. This is a country in what's called the Northern Triangle, which is a part of Central America. And Central America, as we know, is a sub-region in Latin America. In El Salvador, homicide rates have declined, but the country still has one of the world's highest homicide rates. In 2016, that homicide rate was 81 people per 100,000. That was the highest rate that year. It fell to 60 in 2017. It fell to 50 in 2018. And then in 2019, it's 36 per 100,000 people. And so what's interesting about the El Salvador case is that levels of violent crime have dropped considerably in El Salvador, but it still remains one of the world's most violent places. And so it's an interesting case study in the nature of violence, in the reduction in violence, but also what might account for very high levels of organized crime and violence in a Latin American country. And so even despite these reductions, the new murder rate or homicide rate is still greater than 7 times that of the United States. And 10% of all crimes in 2019 in the country were homicides. And so that's a good indicator of the degree of organized crime, because gangs ordinarily engage in turf wars and they kill each other. And so where gangs are more pronounced, homicide rates will be higher, and a larger proportion of categorizable crimes will be homicides. And so El Salvador is one good place for us to kind of start in trying to figure out what's sort of going on here, what might account for this violence, who are the main players, what are the stakes, what is the importance of this, and what are the consequences. So in El Salvador, criminal gangs are very large and are numerous. Some of these gangs have as many as 60 or 70,000 members. And so at that magnitude, gangs of that size become like small armies and capable of challenging the state and really, really undermining the security of the state and changing people's behavior. Oftentimes, criminal gangs will not just fight each other, but of course also engage in extortion, kidnapping, bribery. They use sexual violence. The members of the 18th Street Gang in El Salvador, for example, because of a turf war that they fought with a rival gang, rates of sexual violence skyrocketed in the country. And it was because the gangs were using sexual violence to try to hurt each other as a tactic. And so the scope in the sort of reach of the social problems created by criminal violence, it's enormous. And the nature of these gangs and these organizations is therefore it's obviously something that has to be understood from a variety of perspectives. There are economic dimensions as well as political dimensions. There are social dimensions as well. In this discussion, we'll be thinking about how large these gangs are and how they are at odds with the state and how the state is at odds with gangs. The first question that we lined up when we began this lecture is, why has organized crime become so significant in Latin America? What is the reason for this explosion in organized crime? Especially considering the increase sort of corresponded with democratization in the 30 or so years since democratic transitions. The situation is obviously very complex. And there is no one single factor or one single cause that helps to explain the increase. But there are some important circumstances that have aligned that do seem to be connected to the increase in crime. So first and foremost, Latin American economies provide insufficient economic opportunity. They grow slowly, unemployment rates are usually higher, there's more limited investment, inequality is also very, very high. And in large cities, these dour economic circumstances drive people to seek other means or seek other avenues of making money or making ends meet or occupying themselves or creating a meaning for themselves, putting aside the economic considerations. These insufficient economic opportunities become especially problematic when you take into consideration how rapidly large cities are growing. Latin America has some of the biggest cities in the world and some of the largest metropolitan areas. And so people are crammed together very densely. And this rapid growth combined with minimal economic opportunities, especially in poor areas, means that there's just a breeding ground for the formation of these gangs who pursue organized crime as a means of making money when there are no alternatives. Now, in these poor neighborhoods where gangs proliferate, there's also an absence of basic social services, basic urban infrastructure that ordinarily could be relied on. There's an absence of community organizations that might create links or help to institutionalize social networks that would be more trusting and that might contribute to the development of the community and the creation of new wealth, investments, etc. Poor education systems and an absence of basic hospitals or the kinds of things that might be essential anywhere else. The growing availability of arms and drugs. It was mentioned by Jose that in Mexico, US weapons proliferate and circulate freely, especially since 2000. NAFTA, for instance, opened up trade routes that themselves became lucrative pathways for shipping guns to Mexico, often sometimes in exchange for drugs that were shipped from Mexico to the US. This growing availability of arms and drugs means that there's ready fuel for the formation and the sustenance of these gangs. And then finally, but no less importantly, there's the fact that in Latin American countries, many institutions in the criminal justice system and in the police are just simply ineffective. It goes hand in hand with state weakness. Oftentimes, the police are unable to monopolize control or really effectively manage these kinds of circumstances that might give way to crime and violence and so on. And so that, of course, is often related to corruption in the weakness of the police as a result of budgetary constraints, in the kinds of challenges that Latin American countries, as developing countries, still grapple with. So, for instance, if you can't pay the police enough for them to not be bribed by gangs into allowing the gangs to operate, you create a very risky situation where the police might be bought off by criminal gangs who might want to operate freely. That's a very, very likely situation when the gangs are so powerful and are so wealthy that they can easily spare the expense. And so in Mexico, for instance, police, military, even high-ranking political figures have been basically co-opted by gangs, by criminal gangs, and they've been bribed into doing the bidding of the gangs. And so organized crime is on the rise for reasons like this. When you put all this together, the situation is really quite explosive in terms of its tendency to create opportunities for criminal violence. When you look at this list, this sounds like Latin America. It really does. Even the Latin American countries that are the best off, like Chile, have these problems. If you go to Santiago, you find out quickly that some of these same issues show up there as well. And so one interesting thing that I'll note is that remember that one characteristic of Latin American countries today is that they are increasingly urbanized. They are increasingly transitioning from agricultural economies to more industrial ones that rely on industrial and manufacturing and service sectors. That means that cities are growing very rapidly, and they're growing often at a rate that outpaces the development of urban and civil and organizational infrastructure to support those areas. And so poor areas especially grow very quickly because people who previously worked on the farms are moving to these margins of the cities. In Brazil, they're of course called the favelas, but they're not called that everywhere. And so this is the sort of circumstance underlying the rise in organized crime in Latin America. And so take the example of San Salvador in El Salvador, which is one of the world's most violent cities. San Salvador is awash with corruption within the civil authorities and the police. Certain locations inside the city are disputed by rival gangs, especially in poor slums on the outskirts. And these are often labeled as no man's land. So the police don't go there. No one goes there, unless they have to. And this is the nature of organized crime and violence in Latin American countries. Whole areas of cities, these are the actual no-go zones that were sort of farcically discussed in American media a few years ago in relation to a totally separate issue and debate. These are actual no-go zones, places that are disputed by rival gangs, and these gangs have competing claims to control of these areas, and police do not go there. El Salvador is an extreme example, but it's an example that is illustrative of many experiences in Latin America. And so on the margins, in the slums in particular, violent crime is widespread. Maricela says, one of the bad things about gangs is that they try to recruit young teenagers that are from low-income households. Yeah, and the challenge in Latin America is that the slow growth of the economies and the limited investment mean that there aren't economic opportunities for many young youth. In fact, many of you may know this, and I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but young people tend to live with their families much later in Latin American countries than they do in the United States. And part of that is cultural, but part of it is economic too, in the sense that there are fewer economic opportunities for young people. And so youth unemployment is higher, and rates of violent crime are higher as well. And especially among young people who don't have a lot of alternatives, gangs recruit those individuals and they take advantage of their situation to try to draw on that source of potential personnel, exploiting their situation and highlighting to them that they might have it better if they choose to join a gang. So who are the major players? Who's involved in this sort of tug of war, this battle over organized crime or the reduction in organized crime? Well, on the one hand, you have criminal gangs, you have drug trafficking groups and cartels. Drug trafficking groups are often also criminal gangs, but criminal gangs need not be involved in the production of drugs. They might be involved in the trafficking or the sort of sale or the movement of it in some way, but they might be involved as well in a whole other range of activities. And so we will discuss, as I said before, narco-politics when we return from Thanksgiving, and we'll talk more about the role of criminal groups in drug trafficking then. But today we're talking more broadly about criminal groups and organized criminal syndicates and what kinds of things they're involved in, including but not limited to drug trafficking. Now, on the other hand, you've got national governments. And so in the case of El Salvador, for instance, you do have many gangs, but you also have the national government. The national government has pursued a number of policies to try to reduce criminal violence and reduce gang violence. The national government has also sought to facilitate truces between different gangs. Foreign governments like the US also have an interest and also have a stake, not just because of the investments of US interests, but also because of, for instance, the consequences of criminal violence for migration and patterns of immigration and how that could affect perceptions of US national security, etc. And then there are international organizations like the United Nations, the OAS, the Organization for American States, both of which have units devoted to combating organized crime and in narco trafficking especially. Let's watch a video about El Salvador. This takes us to the ground and shows us what life is like and how it's affected by criminal violence.
It is mid-morning on a busy weekday in San Salvador's Central Market. Vendors hawk fruits and vegetables, clothing, freshly prepared food. Amid the bustle, the strains of a romantic ballad from the 1970s. Tinny music blaring from old speakers at La Esquina del Buen Recuerdo, the corner of happy memories. Elmer Quijanos has owned this stall for at least 20 years. He sells CDs of romantic music from another era.
Pues la gente ya me conoce y saben que solo aquí vienen a traer música antigüita. Antes pues era más bonita, las canciones hablaban más de romance y más respeto. Y ahora pues la música es diferente.
Things are very different today. Just a few days before he spoke to us, Elmer had to hurriedly close his stall in the middle of the day. A shootout between rival gang members in the market left 7 people dead. One alleged gang member fell right at the steps of Elmer's shop. That Wednesday, 30 people died in gang-related violence in the Salvadoran capital. It was one of the bloodiest days since the end of the Civil War in 1992. Two rival gangs, the Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, have fought for control of smuggling routes and entire neighborhoods in cities and towns across the country for decades. Kidnapping for ransom and the extortion of businesses of all sizes are also a lucrative activity. The National Police estimates some 60,000 gang members operate in the country. They were originally founded by returning deportees from Southern California, Salvadorans who, living illegally in the United States, had joined some of the notorious street gangs of Los Angeles and who started their own organizations when they were forced to return to their home country. But last year, the government declared war on the gangs, deploying specialized units across El Salvador. The official murder rate fell by 42%.
Por ejemplo, los pandilleros utilizan como un medio de...
Howard Cotto is the National Police Commissioner charged with leading that war.
Con respecto al 2015, tuvo una baja de más del 20% de los homicidios, es positivo. Pero si además nos vamos al año 2017, donde si comparamos lo que ha sucedido del 1 de enero de este año a la fecha, con lo que sucedió del 1 de enero a esta misma fecha del año pasado, pues los números son mucho más positivos.
Police and military are much more visible everywhere. Units regularly enter houses searching for suspected gang members. It is dangerous, tense work. Suspected gang members are subdued, apprehended, and taken into custody until their identities can be verified. Many times, shootouts break out. Some say the police actions are at times heavy-handed. Activists, including the government human rights ombudsman, claim extrajudicial killings are common. They report at least 100 executions since the last crackdown began in 2015. And the number of people who have disappeared in El Salvador has risen consistently since 2010, from 6 per 10,000 in 2012 to nearly 28 per 10,000 in 2014. Both the gangs and the security forces are blamed for the disappearances. Today's El Salvador shares similarities with the El Salvador of the 80s and early 90s, when the country was being torn apart by a civil war.
This is the impression I have due to the pressure of operations by the security forces, gang members.
Derek Spranger heads the local delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the global humanitarian agency normally mandated to work in war zones. When he arrived in El Salvador in 2012, he was the sole staffer in his office. Today, the ICRC has increased its personnel in the country to 34.
There is obviously a lot of violence due to the use of weapons. We're not in an armed conflict situation, but we're in a situation of other violence which provokes all the same victims as you find during an armed conflict. People who are missing, people who are detained, people who are injured by firearms, people who have to leave their place of origin because they can't stay due to the problems of violence, people including who have to leave the country and become refugees because there's nowhere safe for them here in El Salvador.
As the violence has escalated, so have government efforts that go beyond armed responses to the gangs. The increased patrols and more proactive responses by police units are no longer the only strategies the government is using against gang violence. Closed-circuit cameras now dot San Salvador's main arteries. Officers in a command center can monitor activity around the city. The sensitive cameras can identify the license plates of vehicles reported as stolen or linked to past crimes. In this case, cameras have identified a car carrying possible gang members involved in an extortion case. As he tracks its movements on camera, an officer directs patrolmen on the ground to close in on it to arrest its occupants. But the police commissioner says no strategy can be effective on its own.
Los acusamos, los condenan, la gente aplaude porque sacaste a esos delincuentes de ese sector, pero tú vuelves la vista atrás 6 meses después y ese lugar tiene iguales o peores problemas delictivos. La gente te dice, ¿y por qué no entran a tal lugar? Si es evidente, ahí andan los pandilleros, andan armados, están vendiendo drogas, pero se te olvida que ahí hemos entrado 25 veces a detener sujetos. Entonces te preguntas, ¿y qué pasó? ¿Y por qué florece el crimen de nuevo? Y entonces tienes que cuestionarte, ¿esa es una función únicamente de la policía? ¿Basta con ir a detener? ¿O necesitas hacer otras acciones que fortalezcan el tejido social, la organización social, las comunidades de la gente ahí, que no permita que el crimen vuelva a crecer?
So an effort is also being made to prevent the growth of gangs.
Dale, salga, no espere, salga.
Douglas Asensio runs an after-school soccer program for children in one gang neighborhood in San Salvador.
Los brazos, ahí lo está haciendo mal. Aquí el beneficio es de que los niños los estamos sacando de... O sea, no es que ellos estén en delincuencia, en pandillas, sino que estamos tratando de que ellos no se involucren en pandillas. Porque a Popa, es decir, no sé, todo el mundo, en todas partes tiene fama Popa, no digamos, en la zona de Valle del Sol, por acá cerca, y eso es lo que estamos haciendo nosotros.
Eso, hombre. ¿Va?
Children are coached to play in organized soccer tournaments. The goal is to keep them on the fields and off the streets where they might be recruited by gang members.
Estoy aquí pues, para no estar en la casa aburrido, sin nada que hacer. En vez de andar en la calle con otros amigos, vengo aquí a aprender cosas buenas. Sí, es positivo porque nos ayuda a no andar en pandillas ni nada de eso.
And there are more visible efforts to play on the symbolism of the war on crime. Workers routinely move into gang areas under heavy protection to paint over the graffiti used to mark territories and to intimidate residents. And new programs to rehabilitate former gang members crop up all the time. This one is aimed at giving former gang members new job skills or tools to start small businesses.
Si tú haces solo una cosa, vas a salir mal. De esas visiones es integral, no es sistémica del problema. La visión que tiene que tener un Estado, no solo a través de la policía, sino a través de toda la fuerza del Estado, es precisamente desarrollar capacidades en aquellos que les toca investigar, que les toca llevar a la cárcel a quien ha cometido delito, ¿verdad? Pero que también hay que fortalecer todo el conglomerado de actores sociales o articulara a todos los actores sociales en función de generar acciones que no necesariamente son interpretadas como represivas, sino que son precisamente preventivas.
But for many in El Salvador, living with gang violence is accepted as an inevitable way of life. It has become so pervasive, people have become accustomed to living with it. Years of the Civil War made violence a part of life, and for many, even years later, little has changed.
Este país sí viene de una guerra. Y mucha de la gente que hoy vive aquí sí sabe qué es la guerra. Y muchos de los actores sociales, políticos, económicos, vienen de saber qué es una guerra. Y yo creo que ese planteamiento es más fácil hacerlo cuando no han vivido una guerra. La connotación que tiene para El Salvador hablar de una guerra no está en la teoría.
Era para que hicieran un mapa exactamente de dónde están las ubicaciones.
Journalist Antonio Valladares is a reporter for local television station His regular beat includes monitoring police movements to cover homicides and other acts of violence.
El Salvador ha cambiado tanto el panorama de las muertes que hablar de un fallecido o dos fallecidos casi no es noticia. Por lo general y lastimosamente ahora tenemos que hablar de 3, 4, 5 asesinatos en un solo lugar. Es un quíntuple homicidio para que pueda llamar la atención de la gente. Porque ustedes se pueden fijar acá, están los muertos enfrente, pero la gente sigue con sus comercios, la vida sigue adelante, la gente no se detiene, no se aterroriza, ya es casi parte del diario vivir para un salvadoreño. 6 personas fallecidas.
To Valladares, the reduction in homicide rates compared to previous years is not enough to change perceptions among citizens, which to him constitutes a victory for the gangs.
Aunque todavía no se logra lo que todos quisiéramos, que es tener la tranquilidad absoluta, poder caminar por las calles tranquilos. Eso todavía no se ha logrado, la gente todavía vive con mucho temor y al final eso es lo que importa, la percepción de la población, más que lo que digan las autoridades.
Still, the government says its response is paying off. A recent move to cut off communications between jailed gang leaders and their cohorts still on the streets has complicated gang efforts to coordinate new attacks.
Las pandillas, en el entendido que para ellos es muy importante la conducción que hacen desde las cárceles hacia afuera, las pandillas nunca se esperaron que la acción del Estado a través de las medidas extraordinarias fuera encaminada a romper con la posibilidad de comunicar a la estructura de mando que esté en las cárceles con todo el resto de la estructura que está afuera. Y mucho menos pensaron que esas medidas iban a ser sostenibles en el tiempo.
The gangs have responded by saying the government is violating their rights by cutting off communications between the jailed leaders and the outside world.
Empiezan o fortalecen esta estrategia de querer posicionar al Estado y sobre todo a la policía, a la Fuerza Armada, como violadores de los derechos humanos para desacumular en cuanto a las medidas extraordinarias y poder romper la barrera que impide la comunicación entre los que están adentro y los que están afuera.
And some opinion leaders call continuously for an even stronger response to the violence. Kirio Salgado appears regularly on local television as one of the country's better-known political analysts. He says the prevention work should be accompanied by even tougher crackdowns.
Es disuasivo nada más, pero es disuasivo sin resultados. Vale decir que la policía, desde el punto de vista del gobierno y desde el punto de vista de algunos también como yo, está haciendo un buen trabajo cuando reprime. Pero en general, el trabajo de represión no existe. Las pandillas han matado militares, han matado policías por docenas. Y aún así, el ejército no responde, porque al ejército se le ha dicho, ustedes van a llegar con la represión hasta aquí, sin tocar las estructuras vitales, sin tocar el corazón de las pandillas.
Murder rates might drop or rise as they have for the last year. Shops might continue to close in fear of extortions, and entire families might continue to be displaced following death threats. But life goes on in this small Central American country that has been accustomed to violence for decades.
So that's El Salvador. And you saw so much there. What I thought was striking was the realization of the security forces that deterrence and repression are not enough. There's a need to strengthen the social fabric of these communities so that gang activity is not a favorable alternative for youth. That's an important realization especially for the police, who depend on repression to get a larger budget and to remain influential. But there's also an important debate about how exactly the state should deal with these gang members. And Quinn commented in the chat that he doesn't view it as a violation of human rights to prevent gang members from speaking to other gang members outside of the prison. And I got to thinking while we were watching the video that that is an interesting sort of debate or sort of question. Now, to reiterate, that the strategy of the state, of the government, is to prevent communication between gang members inside the prisons and outside of the prisons. And preventing that communication, they've discovered, can be useful in preventing the activities of these gangs, and then ultimately maybe reducing some of the murder and violence. That's an interesting question. What's also interesting and noteworthy is that this war on gangs has coincided with a pretty significant increase in missing and disappeared people. And although the gangs themselves are responsible for some of these, it's clear that the security forces and the police are responsible as well because of the use of repression in their aggressive tactics. Inevitably, they are killing people or disappearing people who are either not guilty or who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the cost of this policy, and it's a brutal and relentless cost. Let's address some of these issues. First and foremost, do you think that it's a violation of the human rights of prisoners to isolate them when they're put in prisons so that they can't communicate with those outside the prison?
To further my comment, I think if the police can establish a no doubt or with reasonable reasonable doubt or whatever the term is, that they are going to use these channels to commit crimes, then I think it's reasonable to cut these communication channels off between these jailed gang members and the outside world.
Absolutely. And it makes us think about the sort of fundamental purpose of the state, which is to establish a monopoly on violence. And we know that in El Salvador and other Latin American countries, state institutions have often been weak. And in fact, going all the way back to the post-independence period, it's been very difficult to consolidate state structures, not just because of the lawlessness that prevailed between those warring militias, but also because of the diversity of these Latin American societies. And so what that means then is that the state is often going to be hard pressed to contain some of these challenges to peace or its authority, but that the state might have to respond in a variety of ways to try to establish its authority and establish that monopoly of violence. And so in this case, in El Salvador, it's taking the form of isolating these prisoners so that they can break down the communication between the insiders and the outsiders. That's a pretty interesting way of disrupting the way these organizations function. And it's an interesting exertion of state power in a region where traditionally the state institutions have been relatively weak. And so it's an interesting twist in this story. And I think that though there are a lot of disappearances and there's a lot of violence perpetrated by the security forces in El Salvador, they've apparently also had some success in reducing the murder rate, and likely because of this policy of isolating gang members. So it looks like there's a difference of opinion between at least a few students. Abel says, yes, definitely. Delianor says, in this case, no. Jessica says no. Quinn, it looks like Quinn elaborates a little bit. Like, if we know without a reasonable doubt they are going to abuse these communication channels, why should we allow them to communicate with outsiders? I think it's more about saving lives and livelihoods. And that also takes us back to that question about the balance between individual and state interests. You know, where is that line between personal or individual liberty and state authority? And what kinds of state authorities or liberties can be taken in the name of trying to reduce violence and create a safer community? Marcella agrees with Quinn. Samantha says, I understand that yes, it is questionable, the method for human rights, but the Nayib Bukele is one of the most liked presidents of El Salvador. Yeah, that's a good point, Samantha. He actually is a very liked president. He's that young, relatively charismatic president who's behind this policy. And I think that the point here that Samantha's making is that, like, there's a context here underlying this policy, and that context is a context of decades of violence. First, a civil war, and now unremitting gang violence. And so this has to be addressed in some substantial way. And so the state is addressing it in a variety of ways. So far, they've used a lot of repressive tactics. They've used the force of the state, but they're also beginning to look at it from a more integrated perspective, and they're thinking of it more as a social investment than just something that involves the use of force. Jose says, I agree with Quinn. Drug lords are notorious for exercising their free will even within jails. So separation is good. Some of these criminals feel safer in jail since they are in a protected place from other gangs, and they can command those outside, i.e. El Chapo, who considered it a vacation from his duties. Touche, that is a good example. And El Chapo would even just break out or basically coordinate his breakout when he decided that he needed to get out of the jail. And so there's even more to that story, but that's a good example. Quinn says, I think Jose makes a good point as well. This can be a way to save lives within these jails and make sure that justice is served to the people within these jails and to give prisoners a chance at redemption and reformation. Touche. Ishan says, while I don't think that it's a good idea for drug lords to have communication channels, I think it's a slippery slope to not let prisoners have the ability to communicate with the outside world. So Ishan brings up that there are maybe some important limits to state power, and those limits should be sort of non-transpassable, right? And maybe the circumstance or the situation in El Salvador can be better dealt with some of those social investments that we talked about. Instead of taking away some of the rights of prisoners, we're seeing a variety of perspectives here that are all equally valid. I want to comment on a few sort of general patterns and tell you a little bit more about the El Salvador case. So in El Salvador, the government has set up many programs to try to combat crime. Their earliest efforts between 2000 and 2005 were really geared towards zero tolerance and super firm hands or super mano duro policies designed to really use repression to try to eliminate gangs. Policies that didn't take into consideration the social fabric or didn't integrate other dimensions of sort of reformation, as one student put it. But between 2012 and 2016, the government began to kind of pivot and focus more on working and collaborating with the gangs themselves to try to facilitate truces. So that took place in 2012 and 2016 when MS-13 and Barrio 18 came together and actually established a truce. In 2016, around the same time, the government declared a war on gangs. And the period since 2016 has seen some of the most substantial reductions in the homicide rate in El Salvador. We'll talk more about this when we return from Thanksgiving break. That will be on Monday of next week. We'll have just a few more slides, and then we'll get into our next topic, which I believe is narcopolitics. But I hope that you have a fantastic break, no matter what you do or how you spend it. Treat yourself to some rest and relaxation, and be ready to get back at it when we get back together. I hope you enjoy yourselves and that you do enjoy the break and that you can have some fun, even if you have to stay home. But thanks everyone for being here, and I'll see you next time, okay? Bye.